The dust was a living thing on Silas's land. It rose with the morning sun, settled in the creases of his leather gloves, and slept in the empty spaces of the house. For 10 years, since Martha's passing, it had been his most constant companion. The silence was another. It was a heavy, woolen blanket he pulled over himself each night. He did not mind it. He had, in fact, cultivated it the way he cultivated the stubborn corn in the West Field. It was a silence born of loss, watered with memory, and it had grown into a formidable thing that kept the world at a comfortable distance. That morning, the silence was broken. It was not the usual complaint of the wind pump or the rustle of dry leaves. It was a sound that did not belong. A frantic, feathered squawking from the chicken coop, sharp and panicked. It was the sound of a fox, or a coyote, a predator trespassing on his carefully ordered solitude. Silas took the old shotgun from its hooks by the door, its stock worn smooth as a river stone by his father's hands and then his own. He did not hurry. Hurry was a fool's game out here where the land itself set the pace. He moved with a slow, rolling gait, his boots scuffing up little ghosts of dirt behind him. The sun was just clearing the jagged teeth of the eastern ridge, casting long, distorted shadows that turned his small homestead into a place of looming giants and hidden things. The coop door was splintered, hanging crooked on one hinge. Feathers, white and brown, drifted in the still air like unseasonable snow. Inside, the chickens were a chaos of alarm, huddled in the far corner, their beady eyes wide. But there was no fox. There was no coyote. In the center of the coop, half buried in the dirty straw and chicken droppings, was a girl. She was a mess of sharp angles and tangled, straw-matted hair the color of dead grass. Her dress was a collection of rags, frayed and stained, clinging to her frame like wet paper. One of her feet was bare, the skin blue with cold and crosshatched with cuts. She was not looking at the chickens. She was not looking at him. Her gaze was fixed on something far away, something only she could see. Her hands were clenched into fists in her lap, the knuckles white and raw. Silas lowered the shotgun. His heart, a slow and steady drum in his chest, gave a single hard thump against his ribs. He had seen starved dogs with more life in their eyes. He had seen trees struck by lightning that looked less broken. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, the cool morning air washing over him. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath. He cleared his throat, the sound rough and unused. "You hurt." Her head snapped toward him. Her eyes were the color of a winter sky just before a storm, a pale, flat gray. There was no fear in them. That was the most unsettling part. There was only a weariness so profound it seemed ancient, and beneath it, a tiny, banked ember of something hard and hot. She did not answer his question. Her lips, chapped and split, parted. Her voice, when it came, was thin and brittle, like ice cracking over a deep river. "I don't want food." It was not what he expected. It was not what anyone would expect. He had a piece of jerky in his pocket and the thought of the coffee pot on the stove back at the house. These were the currencies of survival, the first gestures of humanity. He waited. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the nervous clucking of the hens. She took a shallow, shuddering breath. The ember in her eyes flared. "I want revenge." The words hung in the dusty air of the chicken coop, absurd and terrible. Revenge was a word for dime novels and heated saloon brawls, not for a half-starved girl who looked as if a strong wind could carry her away. Silas looked at her, at the hollows of her cheeks and the grime etched into her skin, and he saw that she meant it. It was the only thing holding her together. It was the spine in her back, the heat in her blood. He did not ask who. He did not ask why. Such questions were stones thrown into a still, dark well. He was not ready to know what lurked in the depths. He simply nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. He set the shotgun against the doorframe. He stepped forward, his boots sinking into the foul straw. He did not offer a hand. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that she would flinch from it. Instead, he crouched down so his eyes were level with hers. He was a large man, and he made himself smaller, less of a shadow blocking the morning light. "Revenge is a cold meal," he said, his voice low and even. "Best taken on a full stomach. The house is warm." He did not wait for her answer. He turned and walked out of the coop, leaving the splintered door open. He left the shotgun where it was. It was a statement, an offering of trust he was not even sure he felt. As he walked toward the cabin, he did not look back. He listened. He listened for the soft scuffle of bare feet in the dirt, for the sound of a shadow detaching itself from the gloom and choosing to follow. For a long time, there was nothing but the wind. Then, faint and hesitant, he heard it, the sound of her, following him toward the house that had been silent for a decade. The house was one room, built of sturdy pine that had weathered to the color of his own skin. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel bare save for a single, faded photograph of a smiling woman with kind eyes. A sturdy table, 2 chairs, a bed in the corner, and a small cot against the far wall. It was a place stripped down to its essentials. It was the architecture of his grief. He did not look at her as she hesitated on the threshold, a wraith caught between the harsh light outside and the dim quiet within. He moved to the stove, his actions deliberate. He stoked the embers, added a few pieces of kindling, and soon a small fire was crackling, chasing the chill from the room. He filled the coffee pot with water from the bucket and set it on the heat. The smell of coffee grounds filled the air, a scent of civilization, of mornings that were not spent hiding in a chicken coop. She crept inside, silent as a stray cat. She chose the furthest corner, sinking down to the floor and drawing her knees to her chest. She watched him, her gray eyes tracking his every move, her body coiled tight, ready to bolt. She was a wild thing brought indoors, and the house felt suddenly smaller, the air charged with her presence. Silas cut thick slices from a loaf of yesterday's bread and found a wedge of cheese. He put them on a tin plate, along with a dried apple from last fall's meager harvest. He poured coffee into a chipped ceramic mug, the steam rising in a fragrant plume. He placed the plate and the mug on the floor, a few feet from where she sat. He did not push it closer. He did not insist. It was an offering, not a command. He sat at the table with his own plate and mug, his back mostly to her. He ate slowly, listening to the sounds of the house, the fire sighing, the floorboards creaking under his weight. He was acutely aware of her stillness. It was not a peaceful stillness. It was the stillness of a rabbit that has seen the shadow of a hawk. He finished his bread and cheese. He drank his coffee. The plate on the floor remained untouched. He had expected as much. Her hunger was not for food. Not yet. He stood, took his plate to the wash basin and scrubbed it clean. Then he took a blanket from the foot of his bed, one Martha had woven, its threads soft with age, and walked over to her corner. He laid it down beside her, not touching her, just letting it fall in a soft heap. "I don't lock my doors," he said to the room at large. And then he went outside, into the demanding light of day. There were fences to mend. The world did not stop for broken things, man or beast. He worked all day within sight of the cabin. He replaced a rotten post, stretched the wire taut until it hummed with tension, his hands moving with the familiar grace of long practice. Every so often he would glance toward the house. He saw no movement. The door remained closed. The plate of food, he imagined, was still on the floor, the coffee gone cold. He wondered if he had made a mistake, if she had slipped out the back and disappeared back into the unforgiving landscape. The thought left a hollow space in his chest, a feeling he had not expected. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the horizon, he gathered his tools and headed back. The air grew cold quickly, the kind of cold that felt sharp in the lungs. A light was on in the cabin. A single candle, its flame a tiny, wavering star against the growing dark. He paused by the woodpile, his hand resting on the rough bark of a log. Hope was a dangerous thing. He had buried his with Martha, under the simple wooden cross on the hill overlooking the valley. He had no business digging it up. He entered the house quietly. She was still in the corner, but she was wrapped in the blanket. The plate of food was gone. The mug was empty. He saw the clean plate and mug sitting neatly by the wash basin. A small, almost imperceptible shift had occurred. A single stitch in the frayed fabric of the day. He said nothing. He lit the main lantern, filling the room with a warmer, steadier glow. He began to prepare a simple supper. A stew of potatoes, carrots, and a little salted pork. The smell filled the cabin, thick and savory. He worked and she watched. The silence between them was different now. It was less of a void and more of a space that might, in time, be filled. When the stew was ready, he ladled it into 2 bowls. He put one on the table for himself and placed the other on the floor in the same spot as before. He sat and ate. He heard a soft rustling, the scrape of a spoon against ceramic. He did not turn. He just listened to the sound of her eating, a small, quiet rhythm in the heart of his silent house. Section days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun. A routine began to form, unspoken and unwritten. He would rise first, start the fire, and make coffee. When he came back in from his morning chores, she would be awake, the blanket folded neatly in her corner. He would leave food for her, and she would eat it when he was not looking directly at her. She started to move about the house. At first, her movements were small, confined to her corner. Then, one day, he came in to find the floor had been swept clean, the broom resting back in its place. He said nothing, but he noticed. The next day, the tin plates were not just washed but dried and stacked. A few days after that, he found one of his work shirts, which had a tear in the sleeve, laid on his bed. The tear was crudely stitched, the thread uneven, but it was closed. He found her once, standing by the window, looking out at the small, fenced-off plot of land on the hill. Martha's grave. She did not know what it was, not for sure, but she must have guessed. She stood there for a long time, her thin frame silhouetted against the pale afternoon light. He watched her from the barn, a knot tightening in his throat. He saw her shiver, and he turned away, busying himself with oiling a harness, the scent of leather and oil a familiar comfort. When he looked again, she was gone from the window. She never spoke. Her silence was as vast and profound as the landscape outside. He found he did not mind it. His own words had been so few for so long that her quiet was a companion to his own. They communicated in a language of gestures. He would leave a bucket of water by the back door. Later, he would find his shirts washed and stiffly drying on a bush. He would bring in a basket of potatoes from the root cellar. That evening, they would be peeled and ready for the stew. They were 2 ghosts haunting the same house, slowly learning the shape of each other's solitude. One afternoon, he was trying to bake bread. It was something Martha had always done, and his attempts were clumsy and grim. The loaves came out of the small oven either burnt or dense enough to stop a bullet. He pulled out a particularly disastrous specimen, a blackened, rock-hard thing. He set it on the table with a sigh of disgust. From her corner, a sound. It was so small he almost missed it. A dry, rasping noise, like dry leaves skittering across stone. He turned. She had her hand over her mouth, but her shoulders were shaking. It was a laugh, or the ghost of one, fighting its way out of a body that had forgotten how. He looked at the burnt loaf. He looked at her. A slow smile touched his own lips, a foreign feeling. "That loaf died in vain," he said, his voice rusty. She did not reply, but the shaking subsided. A moment of connection, thin as a spider's thread, had been spun between them. That evening he tried again with the bread. This time, as he worked the dough, she rose from her corner. She approached the table slowly, cautiously. She watched his clumsy hands for a moment. Then she pointed a thin finger at the flour sack. He pushed it toward her. She took a small handful and sprinkled it over the sticky dough, her movements precise. She gestured for him to knead, and she watched, occasionally adding a sprinkle of flour or a drop of water from the bucket. She did not speak. She only guided. The loaf that came out of the oven that night was not perfect, but it was bread. It was warm and soft on the inside with a decent crust. He cut 2 thick slices. He put butter on them, and for the first time he did not put her plate on the floor. He set it on the table opposite his own chair. He sat down. He waited. After a long moment she came. She pulled out the other chair and sat, her back straight, her eyes on her plate. They ate together at the table, the silence comfortable, the air thick with the smell of warm bread. A week later, a storm blew in from the north, a furious squall of wind and rain that rattled the windows and screamed down the chimney. The world outside was a churning chaos of gray. Silas spent the day securing the barn and checking on the animals, the rain soaking him to the bone. When he finally came back into the house, dripping and chilled, a fire was roaring in the hearth. The blanket from her corner was draped over his chair, warming by the flames. He stopped in the middle of the room, water pooling around his boots. He looked at the blanket, then at her. She was sitting on the floor by the fire, mending one of her rags with thread she had pulled from a discarded grain sack. She did not look up, but he felt her awareness of him. It was a simple gesture, kindness, but in the small, quiet world they had built, it felt momentous. It was a log placed on a dying fire, and a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the hearth. That night, the storm raged. A crash of lightning split the sky, followed by a boom of thunder that shook the house to its foundations. He heard a sharp gasp from her corner. He sat up in his bed. In the flickering firelight, he could see her. She was sitting bolt upright, her arms wrapped around her knees, her body trembling. He got out of bed, his bare feet cold on the wooden floor. He lit the lantern, keeping the flame low. "The storm will pass," he said softly. She shook her head, her face pale. "It's not the storm," her voice was a ragged whisper. "It's the dark, the small spaces. Don't lock me in." The words came out in a rush, a torrent breaking through a dam of silence. He sat at the table, giving her space. "I told you, I don't lock my doors." She looked at him, her eyes wide and haunted in the lantern light. He could see the terror there, raw and real. It was the terror of a cage. "He did," she whispered. "When I displeased him. A root cellar, dark and damp. Spiders," she shuddered. A violent tremor that shook her whole body. "He said it was to break my pride." Silas's hands, resting on the table, clenched into fists. He thought of the man who would do that to a child, for that is what she was, barely more than a child. A cold, clean anger rose in him, an emotion he had not felt in years. It was sharp and clarifying. "Revenge," he said, the word tasting like rust in his mouth. He was beginning to understand. She nodded, her eyes still fixed on his. "Jedediah Thorne." She said the name as if it were a curse. "He owns the trading post over at Dusty Creek. He owns the sheriff. He owns everything. He bought me from a family that had too many daughters and not enough flour. He said I would be a good wife." Obedient, a bitter, broken sound escaped her lips. "I was not obedient," she told him then. The words came haltingly at first, then in a steady, toneless stream. She spoke of small rebellions. A burnt meal, a misplaced ledger, a sharp word when she was supposed to be silent. She spoke of punishments, the locked cellar, the back of a hand, the humiliation in front of visitors. She spoke of the night she had finally run, stealing away while he was drunk on whiskey and self-importance, running until her lungs burned and her feet bled, hiding in barns and ditches, until she had collapsed in the straw of Silas's chicken coop. "He will come looking for me," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "I am his property. He does not suffer his property to escape." Silas listened, his face grim. The fire crackled, the storm howled, but inside the small cabin, a different kind of storm had broken. The story settled in the air between them, heavy and ugly. "Why did you take me in?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "You could have turned me away, or taken me back to him. There would have been a reward." Silas looked at the photograph on the mantel, at Martha's kind eyes. He thought of the silence that had filled this house for 10 years, a silence that was no longer empty. "This was a good house once," he said, his voice quiet. "It remembered how to be. You just reminded it." He looked back at her. "And I don't hold with men like Jedediah Thorne." He let the fire burn all night, chasing away the shadows. He sat at the table until the storm passed and the first pale light of dawn crept through the window. He watched her as she finally drifted into an exhausted, fitful sleep, her trembling stilled. He had taken in a stray, a broken thing. But now she had a name, a story, a face to her demon. And in telling him, she had handed him a piece of her burden. He found, to his surprise, that it was not heavy at all. Felt like purpose. The threat, when it came, did not arrive with the thunder of hooves or a shouted demand. It came on a piece of paper, delivered by a young boy from the nearest settlement, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe at Silas's isolation. It was a notice, tacked to the door of the general store and now, delivered personally. A formal declaration from Jedediah Thorne, offering a substantial reward for the return of his runaway indentured servant. It described her by her hair color and a small scar on her chin, called her his property, legally bound and purchased. Silas read the paper, his face impassive. He folded it neatly and tucked it into his pocket. He gave the boy a dried apple for his trouble and sent him on his way. He did not need to show her the paper. He could feel her watching him from the doorway of the house, could feel her fear like a drop in temperature. The days that followed were tense. The comfortable silence they had built was replaced by a waiting silence, a silence that listened for the sound of approaching riders. She grew quieter again, her brief flowering of trust curling back in on itself like a plant touched by frost. She ate less. Her eyes were constantly scanning the horizon. Silas went about his work with a grim determination. He chopped wood with a ferocity that was new, the axe biting deep, the clean scent of pine filling the air. He cleaned and oiled the old shotgun, its metal cool and solid in his hands. He was not a man of violence. He had seen enough of it in his youth to last a lifetime. But there were lines that could not be crossed. A man's home was one. Promise, even an unspoken one, was another. One afternoon he found her in the barn. She was holding a pitchfork, testing its weight, its balance. Her knuckles were white on the wooden shaft. She looked small and fierce, a cornered animal preparing for its last stand. "That won't do much against a gun," he said, his voice gentle. She did not startle. "It's better than my hands," she replied, her voice steady. The flatness was gone, replaced by a hard resolve. "He will not put me in the dark again." He nodded.
"No."
"He will not." He went to a dusty wooden chest in the corner of the barn, a chest he had not opened in years. He lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was Martha's old pistol. It was a small, elegant weapon, but it was well maintained. Martha had been a better shot than he was. She had grown up on this land, and she understood its unforgiving nature. He unwrapped it and held it out to the girl. "Do you know how to use one of these?" She looked from the pistol to his face, her gray eyes searching his. She shook her head. "Then it's time you learned," he said. They spent the next 3 afternoons behind the barn, using tin cans set on a fence post as targets. Her hands trembled at first, the weight of the pistol unfamiliar. Her first shots went wide, kicking up dirt far from the mark. But she was a patient student. She listened to his instructions about breath, about grip, about sight. She learned to squeeze the trigger, not pull it. By the end of the 3rd day, she could hit the can 3 times out of 5. The sound of the shots echoed across the valley, a declaration that this quiet place was no longer defenseless. Each successful shot seemed to straighten her spine a little more. The act of learning to defend herself was a reclamation. She was no longer just a victim waiting for the inevitable. She was becoming a participant in her own fate. They came on a Tuesday. 3 riders, dark shapes against the bright, empty sky. Silas saw them first, from the field where he was turning the soil. He straightened up, his hand shading his eyes. He watched them for a long moment as they followed the winding track to his homestead. He felt no surprise, only a grim sense of finality. The waiting was over. He walked back to the house, his stride unhurried. She was on the porch, holding the pistol. It was not pointed at the riders, but held loosely at her side. Ready. Her face was pale but set. All the fear had been burned away, leaving something clean and hard in its place. "Go inside," he said, his voice low. "No," she said. It was not an argument. It was a statement of fact. He did not press her. He simply nodded and took his place on the porch beside her, the old shotgun cradled in his arm. They stood together as the riders approached, two silent figures guarding the threshold. The man in the lead was Jedediah Thorne. He was just as she had described him. A man softened by easy living, his face florid, his eyes small and possessive. He wore a fine coat and a self-satisfied smirk. The two men with him were hired muscle, their faces blank and hard. Thorne reined in his horse a few yards from the porch. His smirk widened as he saw the girl. "Well, well, look what the old hermit dragged in." His eyes raked over her, dismissive and proprietary. "You've caused me a great deal of trouble, girl. It's time to come home." "This is my home," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the still air. It did not tremble. Thorne's eyes narrowed. He shifted his gaze to Silas. "I have a legal paper for her, old man. She is my property. She ran out on her contract. Give her to me, and there'll be no trouble." "She's not property," Silas said, his voice flat and cold as river stone. "And she's not going anywhere." "I'm not asking," Thorne sneered, his hand moving to the fancy pistol at his belt. "I'm telling you, that girl belongs to me. I paid good money for her." "You paid for a servant." The girl's voice cut in, sharp and sudden. "You did not pay for a slave. You did not pay for the right to lock me in a cellar because I burned your supper." A flicker of surprise, then rage, crossed Thorne's face. He was not used to being spoken to this way, especially not by her. "You ungrateful whelp. I gave you a roof over your head. You gave me a cage," she shot back. "I found a home." Thorne's face was turning a deep, mottled red. "I have the law on my side," he bellowed. "Your law doesn't run here," Silas said quietly. He raised the shotgun, not aiming it but just letting the weight of it speak for him. "This is my land, and this is my family. Now you can turn your horses around and ride away, or you can see how our laws work." The two hired men shifted uneasily, their eyes darting from Silas's shotgun to the small, steady pistol in the girl's hand. This was not the easy collection they had been paid for. They were paid to intimidate, not to get into a firefight with a determined old man and a girl who looked like she had nothing left to lose. Thorne hesitated, his bluster failing him in the face of their unified, unyielding silence. He had built his power on the belief that everyone had a price, that everyone could be bent to his will. He looked at the two of them standing on that porch, the weathered old man and the slip of a girl, and he saw something he could not buy and could not break. "This isn't over," he snarled, but his threat was hollow. It was the parting shot of a coward. He yanked on his reins, turning his horse so sharply it whinnied in protest. He cast one last venomous look at the girl. "You will regret this." And then they were gone, riding away in a cloud of their own dust, their retreat a stark admission of defeat. Silas and the girl stood on the porch, watching until they were nothing more than small specks on the horizon. The silence they left behind was vast and clean. He lowered the shotgun. She lowered the pistol. He could see the faint tremor in her hands now that the danger had passed. He turned to her. He saw the tracks of tears on her dusty cheeks, tears she had not allowed to fall in front of Thorne. "You were scared," he said. "It was not an accusation." "I was," she admitted, her voice thick, "but I wasn't alone." He reached out not to touch her, but to take the small pistol from her trembling hand. His fingers brushed against hers. It was the first time they had touched. Her skin was cold. He carefully uncocked the weapon and set it down on the porch rail. He looked at her, really looked at her. He saw not the broken thing from the chicken coop, but the woman who had stood her ground, the woman who had found her voice. She had come here seeking revenge, but she had found something else instead. Resilience, a spine of steel forged in the fire of defiance. "He called you girl," Silas said, his voice soft. "That's not a proper name." She watched him, her gray eyes intent. "My Martha," he began, his voice catching for a moment on the name. Her middle name was Lena. "It means light." He looked out at the valley, now peaceful and golden in the late afternoon sun. "I think it suits you." Lena. She tested the name in her mind. Felt new and strange, but it fit. It was not a name given to her by a man who saw her as property. It was a name given by a man who saw her as light. A small, watery smile touched her lips. "Lena," she said aloud, her own name, for the first time. That night, they burned the notice from Jedediah Thorne in the fireplace. They watched the paper curl and blacken, the words of ownership turning to ash. It was a cleansing, a final, definitive severing of the past. They did not speak of what had happened, but a new ease settled between them. The house, which had once breathed with his grief, now seemed to breathe with a quiet, shared life. The next morning, Lena was humming as she kneaded the bread dough. It was a simple, tuneless sound, but to Silas, it was the most beautiful music he had ever heard. A week later, he took the wooden cross from Martha's grave. He did not remove it. Instead, with a pocket knife and a careful hand, he carved a new name beneath hers. Lena, not as a replacement but as an addition, a grafting of a new branch onto an old tree. When he was done, Lena came and placed a single, stubborn wildflower at the base of the marker. They sat on the porch that evening, watching the stars prick the vast, dark velvet of the sky. The house was warm behind them, the lamp glowing in the window. The silence returned, but it was a different kind now. It was not the silence of loneliness or fear. It was the silence of peace. The silence of two broken people who had, against all odds, stitched their lives together with the raw, strong thread of unspoken kindness. He was no longer just a man in a lonely house, and she was no longer just a girl seeking revenge. They were a family, forged not by blood, but by the simple, profound act of standing together on a dusty porch and choosing light over darkness. This story, it is not just about a rescue. It is about the quiet truth that sometimes the deepest cages are the ones we carry inside us. They are built of fear, of loss, of the names that others have given us, the value they have assigned. We can spend our lives rattling their bars, seeking revenge on the ones who locked us in. But what if revenge is not a destination? What if it is just a signpost pointing the way toward something else, toward a reclamation of the self? So here is your naming. Think of the person who saw you, not your scars, not your past, not the price someone else put on you, but the light you carried even in the darkest cellar. Think of the one who didn't lock the door, who put a plate on the table, who stood with you when the riders came. Maybe you have met them. Maybe you are still waiting. Or maybe, just maybe, you have to learn to be that person for yourself. Because true freedom is not found in the downfall of our enemies. It is found in a quiet moment on a porch, under a sky full of stars, when you finally hear your own name spoken with love, and you realize you are finally home. And if you are brave enough to build that home, you might just find that the fire only changes things if something new is waiting in the ash. You might find that you can stand your ground, and in doing so, you can save not just yourself, but the very soul of a silent, waiting house.